So welcome back to the second part of our program. And it's my pleasure to introduce our second speaker. It is Father George Guiver. Father George was superior of the community of the Resurrection in Mirfield, Yorkshire, and before that he taught liturgy at the College of the Resurrection and Anglican Theological College. He has written extensively on Anglican monastic life and on prayer. It's a long list of books, but probably his best known book is A Company of Voices, A History of Daily Prayer. That was appeared with Canterbury Press, yes, correct?
Yes.
Canterbury Press. And Father George has told me that he's currently working on a study on the Psalms to help people to read the Psalms in a theologically correct way. And obviously Father George will give us an Anglican perspective on monasticism, and the title of his talk is Monastic Life in Tune with the Moment. Father George, thank you very much for coming, and over to you.
Thank you. There is another book which I forgot to bring to sell to you, which I've co-edited about monastic life, it's entitled Oneness, and it's edited by Stephen Platten, and Andrew Louth has written in it on the history of the Skeet, because it's about the hermitage in Northumberland where Brother Harold is, which is a sort of Western Skeet. So the book is called Oneness, and it's a very good read. I think I can say that because I've only written a little bit in it. Western monks and nuns process into church usually, and they sit in order in choir stalls, and then they process out again in a manner that is highly coordinated and disciplined. In the Eastern monastic tradition, you find people disposed much more informally round the church. Behind those kinds of outward differences lie long traditions, each with their own spiritual profundity. And it could be interesting today to have a dialogue about the differences between the two traditions. We could also have a dialogue about Anglican monastic life. My community is Anglican, we could talk about that. However, there is no such thing as Anglican monastic life. There's only Anglicans seeking to live the monastic tradition. My feeling is that it would be far more worthwhile, rather than talking about differences or different ways of life, to look at the unity of the monastic life, which is greater than all the differences. I can illustrate this by the fact that there are various bodies which gather monks and nuns together for conferences and congresses, and that are ecumenical. And the one I know is the International Interconfessional Congress of Religious, and it brings together Roman Catholics, Anglicans, Orthodox, Lutheran monks and nuns. Not everyone knows that there are Lutheran Benedictines, Reformed monks and nuns, and every 2 years we gather in a different monastery. And the experience always is that we are living the same life. And when we're talking, we don't find ourselves talking about the differences very much. And for me, more important than all the differences is the mystery of this unity of the life, which is given by God, and therefore in the end you can't succeed in dividing it up. it seems to me that there is, rather than talking about our different traditions, there is an urgent need for a dialogue between monastic life and the contemporary world, and with very much of the church as well, because much of the church and the churches are very influenced by our modern society, not always in very helpful ways. I'd like to start, in fact, from my experience of Orthodox monasticism. I've been to Romania a lot over the last 40 years, I suppose. And what I have become familiar with in Romania is that the monastery is very much a public place and a focus. And people understand the monastery as a place to visit and to feel at home in. It's a spiritual home, and on Sunday in the countryside, the roads around a monastery will be full of people making their way there. In the Orthodox tradition, the monastery is very much a spiritual focus and a home which everyone, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but everyone, I think, feels belongs to them. It is ours. I once had to collect a Romanian abbess. This was before, while I was still a parish priest. I collect a Romanian abbess from an Anglican contemplative community to take her somewhere else. And she said, as she got in the car, "Well, it's been very good to stay there, but I'm glad I'm getting out of it. You even have to ring the doorbell to get in it." Whereas, which is utterly different from this understanding of the monastery as part of the life stream of the church. Well, in the West, we have had quite a lot of the doorbell approach in the last few hundred years, and my own community, before we refurbished our church 6 years ago, the church was closed. Our services we shared with our guests and visitors, but otherwise they were closed. One thing we were worried about was attracting people from the parish church next door, but we talked with the parish priest, and after refurbishing the church, we now leave it open all day and advertise our services, and they're all public. And the numbers of visitors have rocketed. They've become a problem. We get thousands of people now coming every year to stay in groups, individuals or groups, local people who want to come to the services, even institutions. A college for training for the ministry asked to come and be alongside our monastery because it would be so good for their students, so we get a lot of students as well. And this isn't an experience unique to our own monastery. In the West, more and more people are visiting monasteries. We're moving more towards an Orthodox position, I think, and there is more and more of an open door, because we have a sense that people are banging on the door, pleading for something. Our community has become so busy that we're having to build a new monastery so that we can turn the old one into a centre for visitors, and we can get out of it all and live our life properly, because we're a bit inundated. There is... why do people visit monasteries? With so many people, something is driving them there. Now, partly it is because monasteries have become more accessible. There is a growing interest because of what people have seen on the television and in the cinema, television programmes such as The Monastery. I don't know if you saw a rather strange programme, Bad Habits, Holy Orders, about a group of naughty girls who were delivered to a convent and they were all transformed. or Into the Great Silence, the film made in the Carthusian Monastery, Of Gods and Men, about the Cistercian martyrs, and so on. So, for good or ill, monastic life has suddenly come before people's eyes. Then there is the internet. In the past, nobody in this part of the world encountered monasteries or had access to them. And to say you were a monk or you lived in a monastery would sound just weird. You know, might as well have said I'm a Martian. I come from Mars. But that has changed. There is a perceptible change. And partly I think it is through the internet that if a monastery has a website, then people will come across it and you can discover about the life and so on. And one thing we've found is that after many years of not receiving vocations, we are now receiving young vocations, and all of them are coming via the internet. We've got 2 good young chaps in first profession at the moment, and a novice, and others waiting. And so there are reasons why it isn't quite so outlandish to talk about monastic life nowadays, and many people are intrigued. But as well as film and the internet and so on, there is a deeper reason for the growing interest. The ever-growing spiritual thirst among people today. There is a thirst for meaning, as it is often put. And what many are really looking for, when they say that, is how to be a complete human person. And a key part of it is a sense deep within us that we were made for relationship with something bigger than ourselves, which is in fact someone bigger than ourselves. In the modern paradigm, a modern anthropology, understanding of what it is to be a human being, very widespread is this view that I make myself, that I discover who I am through my own resources within. That is bound to come to a dead end, because it is part of our very nature that we make each other, and that we find ourselves in each other and in God. So on the one hand, there has been, I think, a wonderful development of the valuation of the individual in modern society, but it has gone mad. It has gone over the top. And the mistake has been to see the individual over against community, a revolt against people controlling each other or being subject to conventions and shared practices and so on, and a desire to be a free individual. Whereas in fact the two things belong together, individual and community. Human beings were made for each other. We are social beings, and we cooperate in helping each other discover who we are and how we may live our lives. We continually help to form each other. I find my truth through my brother and sister, not just in here. I mean, part of it is in here because God is waiting in my heart to meet me. Human beings flourish and find themselves when they're living within a community and within a tradition. And one of the challenges in the modern world is to help people understand what tradition means. And you may be familiar with the distinction between traditions and tradition, using them as kind of labels. Traditions are old practices that have got stuck and are very nice. such as the changing of the guard at Buckingham Palace. But a living tradition is like a plant. It is alive, it has roots, and it develops as it goes along. And the English language is a good illustration. I always use that when I'm trying to explain to people about tradition, that the English language is a very good example of what tradition is. It goes back thousands of years. In order to understand it, you need to look into its past, finding the etymology of words, for instance. But it is a fertile soil in which we are able to live and be creative. It is alive, and this is exactly what the Christian tradition is, of course, and the monastic tradition. It's a living thing. So human beings are constitutionally designed to live within a tradition. We don't have within us the means to enable us to be full human beings. And eventually we will discover that, because things will start falling apart. Also, the more you are rooted in tradition, the more it lives in you. I am a lapsed organist, amongst other things, and very occasionally, about every 10 years or so, I'm suddenly asked to play the organ for our college in Holy Week, when there's a lot of organ playing all week. So I have to do a lot of practicing, and I do it by playing the repertoire from 16th century, really right through, plenty of Bach, and also modern stuff. And you don't get this in Orthodoxy, but in Anglican worship you can need to improvise sometimes on the organ. And I find this most mysterious thing, that the more of the repertoire I play, the better my improvisations become, because the repertoire comes out of me. It starts coming through my fingers. And so the tradition of the Church provides us with a repertoire which has a life of its own and comes out in us. So one of the reasons I think people are turning to monasteries is this quest for meaning, and we, as monks and nuns, are called to be custodians, a living vessel of the Christian tradition. Innately people realise this. There's a widespread desire for belonging, for community. And this is closely bound up with the quest for identity. For many students in universities today, identity is one of the big issues. I was a bit taken aback to hear from our students in our college. They go into Sheffield University for some lectures, and they said that so many students at Sheffield at the moment are obsessed with what their gender identity is. But it just shows what a sad state we've come to, that such a relatively superficial thing as that could be what people become obsessed with when, well, it's because they have never been helped to discover their identity, because they've not lived within a strong tradition that can do that. Beneath that surface phenomena like that amongst the Sheffield students, the human depths are longing for things they have been deprived of by modern society. Community, tradition, a shared culture, a repertoire for living life. And the churches today ought to be offering this, but often they aren't, for a variety of reasons. And so people often say that they are attracted to monasteries because they find things there they can no longer find in the parish. And I've heard this said amongst Anglicans, and you might expect it from Anglicans. But I've also had recent conversations with people, Roman Catholics in Germany and in France, who have said the same sort of thing. The Church is going through a travail in which many things are draining away, and it seems to me we will come to a point when new shoots will start to come up. But in the meantime, the role of the monasteries is crucial. One group, which I've already said, has asked to come to us is a training course for clergy in the Church of England. We have a residential seminary which we endeavour to run, and they receive a monastic formation there appropriate to being parish priests. But there's also this regional course, and most of the students come from an evangelical background, and they come to our worship and they lap it up. It's what they're thirsting for. And one thing I would say is that there are many evangelical Christians around today who need really to have the opportunity to have contact with the tradition, because they're waiting for it. They have the love of Christ and so on, and there's a much greater openness than there used to be. And when you ask them what it is they find about coming to our services, we have a good relationship with the course, and they insist that the students come to some of our services as part of their training. One thing they say is they are struck by the worship and the atmosphere of prayer in the church. That's the first thing. The second thing is the brethren. They are amazed that a group of young and old brothers between 25 and 96 years old could live together for life in this disciplined way, centred on prayer, and people repeatedly say they feel strengthened by it, simply the fact that we are there. I don't think we need to do anything in particular. The thing we need to do is to enable people to have contact with monastic life and worship. We don't need to go around trying to help people discover their way in life so much, although that might help. Simply go to a monastery and join the community in its prayer. And I think there are many ways in which you could talk about these impressions. Last Sunday in the Anglican lectionary we had the Gospel from St. John chapter 17, where Christ has completed his discourses to the disciples at the Last Supper, and then he starts to pray to the Father. And he says, the love with which you have known me since before the world began, and they are mine, and I am yours, and so on. And it is as if a curtain is being drawn back upon the eternal loving prayer between Christ and the Father. And that is what prayer is about, isn't it? It's to be drawn into the relationship of love between the Son and the Father in the Holy Spirit. And one way then of talking in scriptural terms about what people say they are finding in a monastery is to say that it draws the curtain back and enables people to have a sense of being drawn into the prayer of Christ to the Father. Then linked to that is something about place. Keep my eye on the time. People repeatedly talk about the importance to them of the place. They say as soon as they come through the gate, it feels different. And we have found ourselves talking quite a lot, using the word climate. And God is holding a piece of ground, and we are his servants in holding that piece of ground, and in that piece of ground, God enables a climate, the climate of the love of Christ for the Father, the climate of the Church, and of prayer. Now, I need to be careful, and I've listened carefully to what the Archimandrite has said about humility. And I need to be careful in not claiming that we, as monks or as nuns, are doing anything special in this, or are worthy of thanks or praise. And here there is a great mystery which has two sides to it. People think sometimes that the brothers must be angels, but they aren't. The life is full of difficulties, and wherever you put human beings together, you will find difficulties. So the first part of this twofold thing I call the sacrament of human difficulties. We know in our community that this effect on visitors isn't our doing, because we have to work hard all the time on our sins. We say that it happens despite us, for we are human and sinful like everybody else. And the difficulties I've called the sacrament because the life is about the truth. It is a quest for truth rather than illusion, or rather than avoidance. And therefore, when difficulties arise amongst brothers in the community, the way to God is the way to the truth. And so it is through the difficulty. So the difficulties aren't a problem that get in the way of a holy life. They're the actual material for it. There is a story of St. Bernard of Clairvaux, who visited a monastery, and the brothers there said, "We have very good relationships, we are very happy, we live very well together, no problems." This slightly irritated him. So he said to them, "Well, you need to start recruiting some difficult brothers so that you may learn to grow in patience, charity, and self-knowledge." This is why the difficulties are such an important part of the life. Again, Father, you talked about descent to the nethermost depths, and this is what the life is about. It's a search for the truth, and the truth, in the search for the truth, we go through darkness to light. So, when I have a difficulty with a brother, it might be the way he eats his breakfast, or it might be a disagreement about there's something you can't put your finger on, human nature being what it is. This is a learning opportunity to learn, first of all, about myself, by seeing how I respond, and what is this saying about me that I need to learn. it's also testing my charity and my patience, and also the commitment never to judging my brother, but rather ourselves. So the first bit, I think, of this mystery of the fact that we unworthy brothers, who are such a motley crew, really, somehow are catalysts for this effect on people. So the other bit is, again, what I would call the sacrament of monastic life. The scholastics in the Middle Ages, in places such as this, Cambridge, I feel rather arbitrarily narrowed the sacraments down to 7, when in fact often in the Fathers you find many other things being referred to as sacraments, including the monastic life. And the fact of the matter is that the life is a living reality in itself. And it works, it does its work despite us. It is bigger than the people who are living it, and our calling is to attend to it and respond to it and allow ourselves to be changed by it, which of course isn't an it. It's God, the Holy Spirit, the presence of Christ. The mystery of a life that is bigger than us. Again, as I said in my response on the mention of monasticism providing a good preparation for married life, in the monastery you find many things which are a preparation for life, for every aspect of life. Now, part of this is that our society is losing many things, and monasteries have become, certainly in this part of the world, a bit like pools in a dried up riverbed, and people come to drink. But the water in the pools doesn't all belong to the monks. The water is for everybody. And the wisdom and the practices as well, of which we are custodians, in some way or other belong to the whole church. This has happened before, this image of the pools and dried up riverbeds. St. Benedict wrote his role at a time when civilization was collapsing, with a vision of the monastery as a place set apart for God. St. Francis, again, in a time of corruption and power in the church, held forth the simple truths of the gospel. And in the 19th century, in this country, certainly in the Anglican Church, well, in the Roman Catholic Church as well, the revival of monastic life went together with a renewed sense of the holiness of the Church in a world in which many, industrialisation, commercialisation, many truths about what it is to be human beings were getting lost. So it's nothing new. Nothing is ever new. We've seen it all before. And so today we find ourselves in this society which is obsessed with the individual, with personal fulfillment, self-creation, and so on, resulting in emptiness, lack of orientation or sense of direction, of belonging, and so on. And another thing I would say here is that we live in a world which believes we can change things with our hands. It's a world which likes to take things by the scruff of the neck and change them through the exercise of the human will. And in monastic life, we never take things by the scruff of the neck. We go at God's pace, and somehow something happens. And there's a kind of a double thing here. On the one hand, monastic life is for everybody, whoever you are. The things that belong to monastic life, I mean, if you think of it, community or solitude, silence, obedience, so on and so on. There are other people living all these things in different ways in the world, perhaps not always in wise ways. So you have to say that as well as being a repository for all the truths of the gospel, the monastery is unique. It is set apart. We live out in a unique way these things, and it's difficult to find a way to express that. I liked Father Sophroni's phrase, the categorical imperative of the Spirit. It is a life where we follow the categorical imperative of the Spirit. Archbishop Rowan Williams, when he gave a talk in Rome, I think, was it at the centenary of the Dominican order or something, he said that a unique feature of monasticism is that it is a form of community that relies entirely upon the gospel for existing as a community. All other forms of human relating are cast into the shadow. Family, nation, career, and so on. So it is a unique way of life in which, at the same time, we can make no claims for ourselves as brothers and sisters, except that we are sinners and are learning the lifelong lesson, journey towards humility. I'm just going to shorten a bit. Yes. Another aspect of the modern world which people need to realise and which they can find simply by visiting a monastery is discovering that it is life-giving to sit under something bigger than yourself, to be in relation to something bigger than yourself, whether it is, obviously, ultimately we are talking about God and the Holy Trinity, but whether it is the church or even a nation, people are even losing that, and your own culture. To sum up, perhaps I can say, ask a question: are we right then, and everybody else is wrong? That would be a very arrogant thing to claim. It is central to the monastic tradition that we should never judge our brothers and sisters, and we should be careful about sitting in judgment on our society. And also, as I said earlier, we have things to learn from it, from modern society. There are many stories in the Desert Fathers about the need not to judge, and I mentioned the one about the dog. In fact, everything that I've been saying really ought to go on a back burner. We need to take note of it, but not trade on it. We need to recognise these things about the monastic life, but not think that we're better than anybody else because it seems to us that we know these things. We need to take note of it and then get on with repenting as the sinners that we are. It's God's job to do the trading, if you like, to work what he wants to work. And ours is simply to live in community with love and repentance and to pray. Sorry, I've lost my voice. Thank you.
Thank you, Father George. Father Zacharias, would you like to respond to Father George's presentation?
Yes, there are many very deep intuitions into the life, to the monastic life, expressed by Father. But yes, the question is always, on one hand, to keep the vision of the great life that has been handed down to us by our fathers, and at the same time to keep the awareness and the consciousness that we are useless servants. We are nothing ourselves, but the tradition to which we belong and the church is absolutely great, and it is a wonderful way for us. Monasticism is a strange life upon earth. Like at Pentecost, we sing that on the day of Pentecost we see strange things, strange doctrines, strange languages, strange life is revealed upon earth. And this life is kept in the monastic tradition very, very strongly, more than, in the whole church, of course, but in a more concrete and palpable way in the monastic tradition. Monks are always appear like fools to the people outside, but we are not surprised for that, and we do not expect anything else. St. Paul says himself that if we want to be wise, we must become first fool. And if we want to become strong, we must become first weak, that is to say, acknowledging our poverty and our sinfulness. So, and it is really a wonder to see that such a perfection of divine life was revealed upon earth from the very beginnings of monasticism in the desert of Egypt. When we read the life of St. Pachomius or the sayings of the Desert Fathers, there is not a more holy book than the sayings of the Desert Fathers. is the very gospel of Christ applied in life. So it is a very important and a great matter continually to be learned.
The Desert Fathers are extraordinary, aren't they? I think that young people just read them stories of the Desert Fathers because, well, they are just simply extraordinary.
Yes,
There's nothing like them.
like nothing. I remember the story of Zacharias, the young monk. A great elder of the desert urged him to give them a word. And he was a young man and he wanted to keep his humility. He didn't want to teach his fellows. And he said to him, "Why do you urge me? I know nothing. I'm just nothing. I cannot speak to you." And the Holy Elder says to him, "Zacharias, I have seen the Holy Spirit descending upon you, so I expect a word from you." And then he took off his hat, he threw it on the ground, he tread upon it, and said, "If the monk is not disposed to become like this rock upon which everybody can tread, he cannot live as a monk. He cannot have the grace of monasticism." Just one thing, for example, one example. For someone in the world would seem absurdity, and yet in that is the very truth of him who said, "The one that serves is greater than the one that sits at meat." And that we see continually in monasticism. It's not to be proud. I'm a bad monk myself. I have seen monks, great monks. Myself, I'm nothing. But I'm convinced that there is nothing on earth like what you can find in monastic tradition.
Zacharias and Father George, thank you very much.